It begins in darkness, cold, immeasurable, and unforgiving. The Atlantic at night was a place where sound carried endlessly and light died instantly, swallowed by waves as tall as buildings. In these waters beneath a starless sky, the fate of an entire nation balanced on steel hulls creaking under strain. Britain, an island empire that once commanded oceans, now found itself depending on fragile merchant ships crawling across the sea like wounded animals, slow, exposed, hunted. The world's most powerful navy could not guarantee their safety. The greatest industrial empire in history could not feed its people without them. And as the Second World War spread like wildfire, a haunting truth emerged. Britain might not be defeated on land or in the air, but strangled at sea. For the men who sailed those convoys, the fear was not of an enemy they could see, but one they almost never could. A U-boat's approach left no sound until it was too late. A torpedo once launched carried no warning flare, no roar, only a white, ghostly wake slicing toward a ship's silhouette. The explosion came next, a violent eruption ripping steel apart, sending oil, debris, and men into the frigid black water. Within minutes, a vessel carrying grain, fuel, munitions, or medical supplies, cargo upon which millions depended, was gone. And with every sinking, Britain's lifeline tightened a little more. This was the convoy gamble, a strategy born not from confidence but from desperation. When war erupted in September 1939, the British Admiralty knew two things immediately: that Germany's U-boats would try to choke the nation to death, and that Britain did not have enough escort ships to protect all its merchant vessels. The lesson had been learned a generation earlier during the First Battle of the Atlantic, when U-boats brought Britain to the edge of starvation. But even armed with that memory, Britain entered this new war critically unprepared. Fewer than 50 destroyers were available for escort duty. Hundreds were needed. The decision to group merchant ships into convoys defended by whatever escorts could be scraped together was a calculated risk. Ships in convoy moved slower. If discovered, they offered a banquet instead of a single meal, but scattered across the ocean alone, they were certain prey. Convoying was not perfect protection, but it was the only protection Britain had. In the early months of the war, the system seemed almost hopeful. Germany had fewer operational U-boats than expected. Many convoys made it through unscathed. Yet beneath the surface, the storm was building. Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of the U-boat arm, understood that victory lay not in isolated attacks, but in overwhelming force, wolfpack tactics. He envisioned dozens of U-boats sweeping the Atlantic in lines, detecting convoys with surface sightings and radio transmissions, then signaling for reinforcements. One U-boat shadowed the conv, others moved in. Soon the attack began at night on the surface, where early Allied radar could not track them and escort ships struggled to see them. The wolfpack tore through merchant columns from every direction, firing torpedoes at point-blank range. Crews fought desperately, but in darkness, order dissolved quickly. As 1940 turned to 1941, Britain's lifeline grew thin. Mountains of wheat, fuel, steel, and ammunition vanished beneath the waves each month. Britain had entered the war with 6 months of grain in reserve. After the first year, the margin shrank dangerously. In London, Prime Minister Winston Churchill read shipping loss reports with a tightening chest. Later, he would write that the U-boat threat was the only danger that truly frightened him. He meant it. Britain could lose cities, airfields, colonies, even armies, but lose the Atlantic and the war was over. The danger deepened when France fell in June 1940. Now German U-boats had access to bases along the French Atlantic coast, Lorient, Brest, Saint-Nazaire. From these massive concrete pens, they could strike directly into the heart of convoy routes without burning precious fuel battling through the North Sea. It was a strategic revolution. U-boats leaving French bases could spend far more time hunting in the central Atlantic. The region's sailors would soon call the Black Pit. There, beyond the range of land-based aircraft, merchant ships relied solely on thin escort screens. Too few destroyers, too few corvettes, too few eyes in the dark. For sailors aboard those escorts, fatigue became a constant companion. Patrols lasted weeks. Sleep was brief, interrupted by sonar contacts, periscope sightings, or sudden alarms. The sea battered them relentlessly. Food spoiled, oil seeped into clothing. Men grew hollow-eyed, yet they pressed on, for the stakes were absolute. Each convoy carried the materials that kept Britain alive: Canadian wheat, American tractors, rubber from Malaya, aircraft engines from Detroit, oil from Venezuela. The Atlantic, wide and ancient, became an artery pumping life toward a nation under siege. But even arteries can be severed, and by early 1941, the knife was dangerously close. The shipping losses began to escalate to levels that could not be ignored. Entire convoys were mauled, ships burned into the night sky, fires visible for miles. Survivors drifted in lifeboats for days, soaked in oil, half frozen, praying for rescue. Many never saw dawn. British morale tightened like a clenched fist. Rationing intensified. Every household felt the pressure of the blockade. Every civilian who opened a half-empty cupboard was feeling the remote decisions made by submariners hundreds of miles away. Still, the Admiralty could not solve its most fundamental problem. There were not enough escorts. Shipyards worked day and night. Canada ramped up massive production of corvettes, small, tough ships that could be built quickly, but even these were not enough. Every convoy sailed with fewer escorts than required. Every gap created an opportunity for the wolf packs, and the wolf packs grew bolder each month. All the while, across the Atlantic, the United States, still officially neutral, watched the unfolding crisis with unease. American merchant ships were attacked. U-boats prowled close to American shores. President Franklin Roosevelt understood that a Britain defeated at sea would leave the United States standing alone against an emboldened Axis bloc, so he stretched neutrality to its limits. The Destroyers for Bases Agreement transferred 50 agging U.S. destroyers to Britain in exchange for Atlantic naval bases. These ships, worn but still valuable, arrived just in time to reinforce the convoy escorts. Then came Lend-Lease, an unprecedented lifeline of supplies, equipment, and munitions flowing toward Britain, but none of it mattered if those supplies could not cross the ocean. In the early 1940s, crossing that ocean was a gamble with terrible odds. Each convoy sailed into uncertainty. Each captain prayed they would get through. Each escort leader rehearsed defense plans, knowing full well that plans shattered the moment the first torpedo struck. And still the ships sailed, the merchant mariners, often undertrained and underpaid, carrying burdens heavier than most armies. They were civilians, but their courage under fire rivaled any soldiers. Many paid with their lives. Yet even as the U-boats tightened their grip, forces were moving slowly, quietly, that would eventually shift the balance. British scientists worked tirelessly to improve radar. Intelligence officers sifted through intercepted signals. Codebreakers at Bletchley Park toiled night and day to crack the German enigma. Shipbuilders raced to produce more escorts. Aircraft manufacturers developed long-range patrol planes to cover the deadly mid-Atlantic gap. In the shadows, analysis and innovation gathered momentum. But in these years, 1940, 1941, early 1942, that momentum was not yet enough. For Britain, the danger remained as vast and cold as the ocean itself. And as the war entered its second full year, the peril deepened further, driven by events far beyond the Atlantic, the widening conflict, the global shortages, and the entry of new, ruthless adversaries into the fight for control of the sea. The world did not yet know it, but the Battle of the Atlantic was about to enter its most desperate phase. The turning of the war in 1941 brought no relief to the merchant sailors ploughing through the Atlantic swells. Instead, new adversities compounded the old. The German Kriegsmarine expanded its U-boat fleet at a pace that far outstripped Allied countermeasures. Every month, more submarines slid from shipyards into the water. Every month, convoys found themselves stalked by greater numbers of enemies who were learning, adapting, refining their tactics. And the ocean, so vast, so indifferent, became a battlefield where endurance mattered as much as firepower. For U-boat commanders, the Atlantic was not only a hunting ground but a proving ground. Young, aggressive skippers rose rapidly through the ranks, earning medals and praise for sinking Allied shipping. The German public heralded these men as heroes, silent hunters defending the Reich by choking Britain's supply lines. Out on the water, their confidence grew. Submarines left French bases in tightly organized formations, fanning out across the expected convoy routes. They communicated with one another through encrypted radio signals, giving Donitz's headquarters unprecedented control over their movements. The Wolfpack strategy was reaching its brutal maturity. Convoys HX, SC, ON, and OB, strings of letters and numbers that to many meant nothing more than shipping schedules, became markers of life and death to the men at sea. Escort commanders studied these designations obsessively, knowing that each code represented dozens of ships, each carrying thousands of tons of precious cargo. They learned to recognize signs of imminent attack, the faint echo on sonar that might be a periscope, the sudden silence of radio chatter, the odd, choppy wake on moonlit water. They learned to trust their instincts, because in the tense hours before a wolfpack struck, instincts often mattered more than instruments. When it came, the assault was not a single event but a sustained chaos. U-boats attacked at night when their low silhouettes were nearly invisible against the waves. They surfaced among the convoy columns, weaving between merchant hulls, firing torpedoes at close range. Escorts raced to intercept them, illuminating the darkness with star shells, hopping to catch a glimpse of a periscope or a conning tower. Gun crews strained their eyes until they burned. Depth charges thundered, sending plumes of water skyward. But the U-boats were relentless. One hit could cripple a tanker. 2 hits could break a freighter in half. Within minutes, ships were burning or sinking, lifeboats were dropping into the water, and the convoy columns were breaking formation in panic. The cold did the rest. Many survivors did not last long in the frigid water. Hypothermia claimed sailors faster than drowning. The escort crews knew this cruel equation. When choosing whether to chase a submarine or rescue survivors, they faced impossible choices: save the living or stop the killers. There were no right answers, only consequences. The crisis worsened sharply in early 1941, when Germany introduced new weapons and tactics. The Type VII and Type IX submarines grew deadlier with improved torpedoes and longer range. The Luftwaffe began operating long-range reconnaissance aircraft over the Atlantic, Focke-Wulf WW2 Condors that could spot convoys from high altitude and relay their positions directly to U-boats. These aircraft were so effective that Winston Churchill called them the scourge of the Atlantic. Merchant captains watched the Condors circling overhead like vultures, knowing their presence foretold disaster. The Allies, stretched thin across the globe, had few immediate answers. Destroyers were diverted to support operations in the Mediterranean. Escorts were needed for troop convoys to North Africa, supply runs to Malta, and later support for the Arctic convoys to the Soviet Union. The demands of a world war strained resources beyond their limits. Every new theater opened in the conflict meant fewer ships available to protect the lifeline of the Atlantic. On land, however, forces were gathering quietly that would change the course of the naval war. At Bletchley Park, cryptanalysts worked tirelessly against the German Enigma. Early successes gave hope, but the introduction of the 4-rotor Enigma machine in 1942 temporarily blinded British intelligence. Suddenly, convoys sailed without the advantage of decoded U-boat movements. It was as if a lighthouse had gone dark on a stormy night. Merchant losses spiked dramatically. The Atlantic once again became what survivors called the graveyard of ships. Among the sailors, fear took many forms. Some feared the torpedo's impact, the sudden upward heave, the metallic shriek of buckling steel, the deafening roar. Others feared the fire that followed, consuming all covered water in sheets of flame. Many feared the cold most of all. A few minutes in the Atlantic could seize a man's muscles, slow his heartbeat, steal his breath. Yet the convoys sailed, they had to. Every crossing delivered materials that Britain needed to continue the war: wheat to feed civilians, coal to fuel factories, bauxite to make aircraft, munitions to arm soldiers. Each sinking tightened rationing at home. Each loss weakened morale. Even so, some convoys achieved almost miraculous success. When escorts were plentiful and weather cooperated, the convoy system worked remarkably well. Merchant ships arrived battered but safe. Their crews, exhausted but alive, unloaded their cargo in Liverpool, Glasgow, Bristol. Newspapers reported these successes with relief, but the losses rarely made headlines, and when they did, the public rarely saw the full scale of the catastrophe. The Admiralty carefully controlled information about shipping casualties to prevent panic. Only later would civilians understand just how close their nation had come to starvation. In the spring of 1941, the situation reached a critical point. German U-boats were sinking merchant ships faster than the Allies could replace them. The balance tilted dangerously. The more ships lost, the fewer remained to carry goods. The longer the convoy routes stretched, the fewer escorts were available to protect them. It was a vicious cycle that threatened to break at any moment. In London, Churchill demanded solutions. The Admiralty pressed shipyards to accelerate production of escorts. Canadian yards worked around the clock to launch Flower-class corvettes, small, rugged vessels capable of battling the Atlantic's worst weather. These ships, though cramped and uncomfortable, became essential to convoy defense. Their crews were often young and inexperienced, but they learned quickly. Many would later say that life aboard a corvette aged a man faster than any other wartime service. Yet even with new escorts entering service, Britain still faced an inescapable reality. The Atlantic was too vast and the U-boat threat too numerous for any rapid solution. The Royal Navy needed more ships, more aircraft, more intelligence. The United States, though not yet officially at war, edged closer to open support. American destroyers began escorting convoys partway across the Atlantic. Joint patrol zones expanded. The Atlantic grew more tightly knit between the two nations, forming an alliance that would eventually turn the tide. But at this stage of the war, early 1941 into 1942, the outcome remained uncertain. Britain stood at the threshold of disaster. Each convoy was a gamble, each decision carried enormous weight, and each new loss pushed the nation closer to a point of no return. The storm had not yet peaked. That lay ahead in the darkest year of the Atlantic struggle, when U-boats would swarm the ocean in unprecedented numbers and Britain's lifeline would stretch to the breaking point. By the end of 1941, the Atlantic had become a crucible where nations were tested not just by fire but by endurance. The long struggle had already taken tens of thousands of lives, yet the stakes only grew higher. With each passing month, Britain's dependence on imported food and fuel deepened. A modern industrial nation could no longer feed itself from its own soil. It needed the arteries of global trade open, flowing, reliable. And Hitler knew this. He understood that if he could sever those arteries, if he could starve Britain of the resources needed to sustain both its people and its war effort, then victory might come without a single German soldier setting foot on English shores. This was the logic behind the intensified U-boat campaign, a strategy not of glorious naval battles but of relentless attrition. Dönitz envisioned the Atlantic as a vast noose tightening around Britain. He believed that with enough submarines operating in coordinated packs, Germany could sink Allied shipping faster than new vessels could be built. And for a time, the numbers supported his vision. Each fresh U-boat flotilla that sailed from the fortified pens of Lorient, Brest, or Saint-Nazaire represented another tightening of that noose. Yet even as the U-boat fleet expanded, the Allied convoy system grew more complicated. Convoys had to be formed at precise times to maximize escort availability. They had to travel at the speed of the slowest ship, often no more than 9 knots. They had to stay compact enough for escorts to protect them, yet spread out enough to avoid collisions in rough seas. These requirements turned every convoy into a carefully orchestrated ballet of steel and steam, choreographed by admirals who understood that one misstep might cost dozens of ships. On the merchant decks, the routine was a blend of monotony and terror. Days passed with little more than the rhythmic thud of the engine and the gentle roll of the horizon. Then, without warning, everything could change. A torpedo strike was sudden and devastating. The initial explosion ripped through the hull like a fist through paper, sending shockwaves through metal, cargo, and crew alike. Lights failed, bulkheads buckled, steam hissed from ruptured pipes. Men scrambled through smoke-filled corridors toward the lifeboats, their boots slipping on tilted decks slick with oil. Survival depended on seconds. Some ships remained afloat long enough for an orderly evacuation. Others rolled over and vanished within minutes, leaving only scattered debris and a widening oil slick. Escorts rushed in whenever possible, lowering scrambling nets, throwing lines, dragging half-conscious survivors aboard. But not all convoys had enough escorts to provide this essential protection. In many cases, the thin screen of destroyers and corvettes struggled simply to fend off the attackers, leaving little time or capacity for rescue work. This brutal calculus grew even harsher with the onset of what sailors called the Black Pit, the mid-Atlantic gap where land-based aircraft could not reach. Here, in a vast expanse of ocean beyond the range of Allied air cover, U-boats enjoyed almost complete freedom. Escorts were isolated, unsupported, often outnumbered. Wolf packs lurking beneath the surface struck repeatedly, sometimes over several nights, wearing down the defenders, exhausting their crews, and overwhelming their capacity to respond. It was in this deadly environment that some of the most intense convoy battles of the war occurred. Convoy SC-42, for instance, suffered devastating losses in September 1941. 20 ships were sunk in a prolonged attack that stretched escort resources to their absolute limits. The men who survived described scenes approaching chaos, burning tankers lighting the night with pillars of flame, explosions echoing across the waves, and the eerie silence that followed each sinking. These were the sounds and images that came to define the Atlantic War for those who lived through it. Meanwhile, on the German side, success brought both pride and peril. U-boat crews celebrated their sinkings with quiet toasts and handshakes. Radios crackled with coded messages acknowledging new tonnage destroyed. Yet the ocean was unforgiving even to the hunters. Depth charge attacks grew more precise as Allied tactics improved. The psychological toll intensified as U-boats endured prolonged hunts, sometimes spending hours submerged with oxygen dwindling and temperatures rising. Crews lay silently in their bunks as metal groaned around them, each man listening for the telltale whistle of an approaching charge, each hoping that the next explosion would not be the one that crushed their hull. The broader strategic picture was no less dramatic. In Washington, the United States inched ever closer to open conflict. American destroyers operating under neutrality patrols escorted convoys partway across the Atlantic. Encounters with German submarines grew more frequent. When USS Reuben James was sunk in October 1941, killing over 100 American sailors, the event shocked the United States. It was a prelude to a wider war, one that would erupt fully after Pearl Harbor. America's entry into the conflict transformed the Atlantic overnight. The United States Navy brought fresh strength, destroyers, escort carriers, long-range aircraft, and a massive shipbuilding industry capable of producing new merchant vessels at unprecedented speed. But these benefits would take months to materialize. In the immediate aftermath of America's entry, the U-boats exploited the chaos of reorganization and struck with ferocity along the East Coast in a campaign the Germans called Operation Paukenschlag, drumbeat. American coastal waters, poorly defended and brightly lit, became easy hunting grounds. U-boats cruised offshore and sank tankers one after another, their fires visible from crowded beaches. Despite the new alliance between Britain and the United States, this was a disastrous moment. Merchant losses skyrocketed, oil shortages threatened Allied operations, and the Battle of the Atlantic, far from nearing resolution, was entering a new and more dangerous phase. Yet even in this perilous period, the foundations of eventual victory remained in motion. Allied scientists worked tirelessly on new radar technologies capable of detecting submarines at greater distances and in worsening weather conditions. Shipyards expanded their production lines, launching Liberty ships in weeks instead of months. Aircrews trained intensively for long-range patrols that would one day seal the air gap, and above all, the intelligence war continued. Cryptanalysts at Bletchley Park pored over intercepted German communications with a dedication born of necessity. Every message that could be deciphered meant a convoy saved, a submarine avoided, a ship spared. Their work, shrouded in secrecy, formed one of the hidden pillars of Allied survival. But progress came in bursts, each breakthrough followed by new challenges as the Germans refined their encryption methods. For merchant sailors and escort crews, however, the mysteries of code-breaking mattered little during the daily grind of survival. They faced the immediate reality, the cold, the darkness, the constant threat of attack. Their world narrowed to the few dozen yards of steel they stood on, the men around them, and the endless ocean in every direction. Each day alive was a victory. Each completed crossing was a triumph. But storms were gathering once more. The tide was about to swing further in Germany's favor, pushing Britain to the brink of collapse in the coming year, a year when losses would reach catastrophic levels, when convoys would disappear entirely, when even Churchill feared that the Atlantic War might finally be lost. And that darkest year was now just ahead. Yet even as the Admiralty reorganized its escort groups and refined the convoy lanes across the North Atlantic, the peril only deepened. Winter storms rolled across the ocean, towering walls of water battering ships already pushed to their mechanical limits. The cold was not merely uncomfortable, it was lethal. Steel grew brittle, decks turned to ice sheets. And in these conditions, the U-boats thrived, slipping beneath the waves where no storm could touch them, closing in on convoys that could barely hold station in the chaos of wind and spray. German commanders understood that nature itself was their ally. In the darkest months of 1941, convoys crept along ocean routes where daylight was scarce, visibility nearly nil, and radar still primitive. A single submarine, even without firing a torpedo, could shadow a formation for hours, radioing its position back to BDU headquarters. Once located, dozens more converged with mechanical precision, their movements orchestrated by Dernitz's staff officers, who watched the convoy's progress on plotting tables lit by dim red lamps deep inside bunkered command rooms. By the time escorts realized they were being tracked, it was often too late. The Wolfpack tightened its net around them, each U-boat captain creeping to within striking distance, waiting for the signal. Some slipped into position at periscope depth, their lenses beading with seawater as the silhouettes of merchantmen emerged like ghosts. Others approached on the surface, faster and more maneuverable there, invisible in the black Atlantic night but for the faint foam of their bow waves. For merchant sailors, the attack often came without warning. One moment the convoy would be rolling through the swell, the next a column of water and flame erupted skyward, the blast strong enough to lift a ship from beneath. Men were thrown into the sea, struggling to surface amid burning oil. Signal lamps blinked in frantic code as escorts veered hard toward the source of the explosion, listening for the echo of sonar contacts that might reveal where a U-boat lurked. Convoys were not helpless, far from it. The Royal Navy had crews of professional sailors hardened by decades of global service, and many of the merchant seamen were equally experienced. Depth charges could crack hull plates or force a submarine to dive too deep for comfort. Escorts maneuvered in tight, disciplined sweeps, engines roaring as they hunted the invisible predator below. Each successful counterattack electrified the crew, proof that the balance of fear did not run only one way. But the struggle was uneven. The ocean was vast, and U-boats could strike anywhere. Britain was forced to protect hundreds of convoy routes stretching from the Caribbean to Murmansk, from Freetown to Halifax. For every escort deployed, another route remained dangerously thin, and for each U-boat sunk, an operation requiring skill, luck, and often dozens of ships, Dernitz commissioned another. Germany's shipyards worked around the clock, turning out submarines faster than Britain could replace its lost merchantmen. The sense of vulnerability spread from the bridge of every cargo ship to the highest levels of government in London. Reports piled up on Churchill's desk, each one a tally of dead sailors, shattered hulls, and precious cargo gone to the bottom. Oil tankers were the most critical loss. Without fuel, Britain's aircraft, vehicles and factories would grind to a halt. Food shortages deepened. Lines lengthened across cities already weary from bombings. It was clear to everyone, from the dock workers unloading convoys to the ministers debating strategy, that the Battle of the Atlantic was tightening like a noose. Still, convoys sailed. They sailed because they had no choice. Every crossing was a gamble, but the alternative, a Britain starved, isolated and defenseless, was unthinkable. And so ship after ship left port, bowing into the wind, escorted by warships whose crews knew that one mistake, one moment of complacency could doom them all. It was a test of endurance, nerve and resourcefulness on a scale no navy had ever faced. As spring approached, the Atlantic shifted again. Days grew longer, fog thickened over the cold waters, and in those swirling, colourless mists a new threat emerged, one that would challenge Britain's fragile lifeline in ways even the wolf packs had not yet achieved. The fog banks of early 1942 settled over the North Atlantic like a shroud, blurring the horizon and swallowing sound. For sailors, it was a double-edged sword. Fog concealed a convoy from distant U-boat spotters, but it also blinded escorts, muffled sonar returns, and smothered visibility so thoroughly that ships sometimes passed within a few hundred meters of each other without ever realizing it. In this grey, drifting world, danger could be anywhere, and often was. It was during this period that the Germans found a new advantage. America had entered the war, its navy expanding faster than any in history, yet the East Coast remained dangerously unprepared. Coastal cities shone with lights, merchant ships sailed silhouetted against glowing skylines. U-boat commanders could scarcely believe their luck. They patrolled offshore, scanning the horizon for the bright outlines of tankers and freighters, torpedoing them with near impunity. Flames illuminated the beaches of New Jersey and North Carolina as ships burned in plain sight of stunned civilians. This second happy time, as the U-boat crews called it, wreaked havoc on the Allied supply system. Britain had hoped that American entry into the war would shift the balance decisively, but instead it exposed a new vulnerability. Oil shipments from the Gulf of Mexico, grain from Canada, and war material from US factories all had to move by sea. Every ship lost off the American coast tightened the strain felt in Liverpool, Glasgow, and London. For the sailors aboard those convoys, the mood grew grim. They watched the casualty lists rise and felt the weight of each sinking like a blow. Merchant seamen knew they were unarmed or lightly armed at best. Their ships were slow, their holds filled with cargo that, when hit, could ignite or explode with horrifying speed. Still they went voyage after voyage, drawn not by glory or patriotism alone, but by duty, and the knowledge that without them, Britain's survival was doubtful. Back in Europe, Dönitz pressed every advantage. His wolfpacks coordinated more aggressively than ever, striking not only at the Atlantic lanes but along the routes to Murmansk and the Mediterranean. New U-boats rolled off the production lines. BDU headquarters refined tactics, improving communications security, training standards and navigational accuracy. The Kriegsmarine believed, correctly for a time, that they were nearing the point where Allied logistics might collapse entirely. In London, the crisis forced innovation. After years of internal debate, the Admiralty accelerated the formation of specialized escort groups trained to operate as cohesive units rather than loosely assembled formations. These teams practiced anti-submarine maneuvers relentlessly, memorizing each other's signals and developing a sixth sense for how to react under fire. When a convoy came under attack, they moved with almost instinctive coordination, hemming in a submarine, forcing it to dive, and depth-charging it without hesitation. Yet technology was advancing unevenly. Radar improved slowly. Sonar, then known as ASDIC, worked well only under ideal conditions, detecting a U-boat directly ahead and only when it was submerged. At night, when submarines surfaced to charge batteries and attack, they became nearly invisible. Searchlights revealed more than they concealed, giving away escort positions. And aircraft, which would one day dominate the Atlantic, still lacked the range to cover the Central Ocean Gap, an expanse sailors grimly nicknamed the Black Pit. It was inside this void of air cover, beneath waters so deep they seemed to have no bottom, that the wolf packs operated with terrifying efficiency. Convoys passing through the Black Pit were pushed to the limit, knowing no help could come from above. Messages relayed to shore were often days old by the time headquarters received them. Everything depended on the escort commander's judgment, his ability to read the sea, anticipate torpedo tracks, and choose when to defend and when to counterattack. And still, convoys persevered. They spread across the ocean like a great circulatory system, linking continents through sheer willpower. Every ship that reached Britain brought fuel to heat homes and power tanks, wheat to feed children, and raw materials to build aircraft that would eventually take the fight to Germany. Convoys were more than logistical formations, they were lifelines, fragile but unbroken. By mid-1942, however, the strain reached its peak. Losses soared faster than Allied shipbuilding could replace them. Charts in the war room showed a widening gap between tonnage sunk and tonnage launched. Analysts warned that if the trend continued, Britain would run out of merchant ships entirely. In the cold, wind-lashed operations rooms of Scapa Flow and Liverpool, officers studied incoming reports with mounting dread. Somewhere beyond the reach of land-based aircraft, a vast wolf pack was forming, larger, more coordinated, and more determined than anything yet seen. And it was waiting. Waiting for the next convoy to enter the Black Pit. Waiting for darkness. Waiting to strike her. The summer of 1942 arrived not with relief, but with escalation. Germany had redeployed dozens of its most skilled U-boat captains into the mid-Atlantic, concentrating them into larger wolf packs positioned like invisible minefields across the convoy routes. These were not scattered patrols anymore. They were coordinated hunter-killer formations, linked by encrypted radio, guided by intelligence analysts, and driven by the belief that victory at sea was within their grasp. Convoys entering the Central Ocean began to feel this pressure almost immediately. The attacks followed a chilling rhythm, a sighting by a single U-boat, a shadowing operation stretching across hours or even days, then a sudden flurry of torpedoes in the dark as the Wolfpack descended. Merchantmen vanished in thunderous explosions. Escorts darted through columns of water, depth-charging suspected contacts while other ships zigzagged wildly, their crews shouting over the roar of engines and the hiss of steam. Within the cramped steel hulls of the U-boats, the atmosphere was tense but confident. Crews operated with a grim professionalism honed over years. They maneuvered their vessels with surgical precision, using the surface for speed, the depths for concealment, their torpedoes for maximum effect. Some captains had sunk dozens of Allied ships, others were ambitious newcomers keen to prove themselves. All shared the same conviction that they were weakening the British Empire at its most vulnerable point. And for a time, they were right. In London, the losses were catastrophic. Entire convoys were mauled. Ammunition ships, tankers, and troop transports disappeared in minutes. The British cabinet, monitoring the figures, recognized the severity of the situation with growing alarm. Churchill, who understood the Battle of the Atlantic as the true heart of the war, was tormented by each sinking report. He famously wrote that the U-boat Peril frightened him more than any other threat, including the Luftwaffe and later the atomic bomb. The crisis deepened when British intelligence discovered that the Germans had improved their encryption methods. A newer version of the Enigma machine complicated Allied code breaking. Contact reports from U-boats, once deciphered with useful speed, now took longer to interpret or came too late to act on. Without timely intelligence, convoys sailed blind, unaware of ambushes forming hundreds of miles ahead. In the North Atlantic, fog, storms, and rough seas added to the chaos. The ocean itself seemed to conspire with the enemy. Lookouts stood shivering at their stations while waves broke over the bow, soaking them to the bone. The eerie glow of phosphorescence sometimes betrayed the movement of ships. Other nights, even at a few hundred meters, a vessel vanished into darkness as if swallowed by the sea. Men learned to live with dread, coiled tight like a rope, waiting for the next blast. The wolfpacks became bolder. Some attacked from within the convoy columns, slipping through gaps and firing torpedoes at point-blank range. Others lingered on the edges, picking off stragglers. Escorts were overwhelmed by sheer numbers. They could chase one U-boat, but three more would slip into its place. Ammunition ran low, crews grew exhausted, yet convoys continued, each one more vital than the last. The strain reached a breaking point with the disastrous battles for Convoy PQ-17 in the Arctic and Convoy SC-107 in the mid-Atlantic. SC-107 especially became a grim case study in wolfpack dominance. More than a dozen U-boats attacked in waves, crippling the convoy's defensive line. Ships burned for days, drifting as fires lit the fog from within. Survivors clung to lifeboats in frigid water, numb and shivering, hoping desperately that an escort would return for them. Meanwhile, in Berlin, Dönitz believed that the Allies were nearing collapse. His staff calculated that if they could maintain the sinking rate for just a few more months, Britain's merchant fleet would be too depleted to sustain its war effort. German propaganda trumpeted each new success, portraying the U-boat arm as the spearhead of a decisive maritime victory. But Germany had misunderstood the resilience and the innovation of its enemies. Deep within British laboratories, workshops and intelligence centers, a technological shift was taking shape. Radar improvements, high-frequency direction finding, more effective depth charges, and new escort vessels were entering operational service. In American shipyards, Liberty ships rolled off the assembly lines at unprecedented speed. And in the skies, aircraft capable of crossing the Black Pit were finally becoming reality. The wolfpacks did not know it yet, but the tide was beginning to turn. The Allies were preparing to unleash a storm of countermeasures that would challenge every advantage the U-boats had gained. The Battle of the Atlantic was about to enter its most decisive phase. By late 1942 and early 1943, a subtle but unmistakable shift began to ripple through the Battle of the Atlantic. It did not come as a single breakthrough or dramatic turning point, but through a convergence of innovations, technological, tactical, and industrial, that gradually began tightening the noose around the U-boat arm. What had once been a near collapse of Britain's lifeline was, step by painstaking step, transforming into a resurgence of Allied strength. The first signs emerged in the realm of intelligence. At Bletchley Park, cryptanalysts worked with relentless determination to recover their advantage over German communications. After months of frustration, their efforts bore fruit. New techniques, along with intelligence captured from U-boats and weather trawlers, allowed the Allies to break back into key Enigma networks. Suddenly, the fog of uncertainty that had plagued convoy planning began to lift. Admirals could redirect shipping away from wolf packs, sometimes by margins of hundreds of miles, saving countless lives and thousands of tons of vital cargo. But intelligence alone could not win the battle. On the front lines at sea, escorts were receiving new tools that fundamentally reshaped anti-submarine warfare. Radar sets became smaller, more reliable, and more sensitive. The ASV Mark III radar in particular gave long-range patrol aircraft the ability to locate surfaced U-boats even on the darkest nights. Meanwhile, the introduction of the Hedgehog anti-submarine mortar revolutionized attacks. Instead of dropping depth charges in rough estimates, escorts could now project dozens of contact-fused bombs in a forward-firing pattern, dramatically increasing the odds of hitting a submerged submarine. Other developments were equally transformative. High-frequency direction finding, HUF-DUF, as sailors called it, allowed ships to triangulate U-boat radio transmissions in real time. The Germans, who believed their encrypted messages made them invisible, had no idea that even a few seconds of radio chatter could betray their position to an entire convoy. The most crucial change, however, came from the air. The Allies finally closed the notorious mid-ocean gap, the Black Pit, with the arrival of long-range aircraft like the consolidated B-24 Liberator equipped with extended fuel tanks. These aircraft could now patrol deep into the Atlantic, their presence altering the balance overnight. Submarines caught on the surface were forced to crash dive, disrupting their attacks and draining precious battery power. Those too slow or too unlucky were destroyed in sudden, devastating strikes. In the ocean's depths, morale began to shift as well. U-boat crews, once the elite of the German Navy, now faced an enemy growing stronger by the day. Rumors circulated of entire wolf packs being routed by aggressive escort groups. Captains reported more aircraft sightings, more radar detections, more near misses. The Atlantic, which had long been their hunting ground, was becoming increasingly hostile. Meanwhile, Britain and the United States were expanding their naval construction at a pace unmatched in history. Escort carriers, frigates, corvettes, and destroyer escorts poured into the fleet. Each new ship meant one more convoy protected, one more wolfpack challenged. And then there were the Liberty ships, simple, rugged freighters built so rapidly that shipyards could replace losses faster than U-boats could sink them. The German strategy of tonnage warfare, which depended on outpacing Allied shipbuilding, now faced a reality it could not overcome. The Allies had become too industrially powerful. The psychological tide shifted just as dramatically. Where once convoys had braced for the worst, now escorts hunted with growing confidence. Veteran commanders shared tactics that worked: coordinated attacks, aggressive pursuit, disciplined use of radar and sonar. The hunter was becoming the hunted. And the wolf packs felt the pressure. In March 1943, still one of the most dangerous months of the entire battle, the Germans launched massive coordinated assaults on several key convoys, HX-229 and SC-122 among them. It was supposed to be the decisive blow, the final attempt to break Britain's back. For several days the fighting was brutal, ships were lost, U-boats pressed in with ferocity. The outcome teetered in the balance. But the convoys survived. And more importantly, the wolf packs suffered losses they could ill afford. In the aftermath, Allied commanders recognized that something fundamental had changed. They were no longer merely reacting to U-boat attacks, they were neutralizing them. For the first time since the war began, the German submarine arm was battered, bloodied, and uncertain of its future. The stage was set for a climactic shift, one that would mark the beginning of the end for the U-boat menace.